friend of mine recently posed a question on his podcast about carrion plants. Now, if you don't know what one is, the carrion plant emits an odor that is very similar to rotting flesh, thus the name carrion, which means decaying flesh. Nice, huh? So this odor attracts flies which serve to pollinate the flower. Now, the question posed on my friend's show was how? How does the plant know to do this? How did they figure out that to attract flies, they needed to emit a scent to do so? Now, in all fairness, I don't think my friend truly believes that the plant figured this out. He was simply posing a question that many people ask. It's an amazing example of a bait and switch to attract flies. Now, if you've been following this show for, say, the last 80 or so episodes, then you already know the answer. Of course they don't know. So, we'll answer that little question on this episode of Evolution Talk.
There is grandeur in this view of life.
Welcome to Evolution Talk with Rick Coast, an introduction to the oldest story ever told.
Now, when I was a kid, I used to marvel at how things seemed to be put together. I don't mean the plastic models I used to play with, but the way nature appeared to work. When I learned that plants provide the oxygen I breathe and that I provide the carbon dioxide they need, it was proof that there was a grand design there. Or so I thought. It wasn't until later that I learned that the symbiotic relationship between animals and plants took an extremely long time to evolve. There was no design there. It was a series of small steps, little adaptations along the way that both animals and plants benefited from. But it's still easy to stand in awe of the way things happen, especially as a human being. We want to know why something is the way it is. When we can't understand it, we look for agency. A creaking step in a house late at night might be a ghost, until we realize it's simply the house shifting with the change of seasons. So, of course, when presented with a plant that appears to take advantage of something in a very unplant-like way, we look for agency. How did the plant know to do that? When a tree stretches its branches toward the sunny spot in the yard, it's difficult not to think it's doing it on purpose. We fail to think about the little chemical reactions taking place that cause that limb to grow in that direction, all brought about by the sunlight itself. The branch has no choice but to grow in that direction. It's in its nature to do so. And this aligns with the topic of today's show, agency and the ability of a plant to seemingly perform an action with an end goal in mind, a reason. So, enter the carrion plant. The carrion plant is also known as the starfish flower because of its very large 5-pointed flowers. Flowers which can grow upwards of 16 inches across. Not an easy flower to miss. And when it comes to large flowers, they have little competition in the plant world. The carrion plant, or also known as the Stapelia gigante, and I'm sure I mispronounced that, they grow in the desert regions of South Africa. Now there's a problem though. In those regions, there are no honeybees. In my backyard, I can watch bees travel from flower to flower, unknowingly coating themselves with pollen before moving on to the next flower. That's how pollination works. But given that there are no bees to help the carrion plant pollinate, the plant had to find another means of transportation, another delivery method. With not much else to work with, they turned to flies. And how did they do this? Well, flies love dead things. And how do they find these dead things to fill their little fly bellies with? By scent. So, the carrion plant faced a dilemma. It could either die out or find a way to attract these little delivery systems on wings. So they did. They developed extra large flowers and an odor irresistible to flies. The passing fly was drawn to it like a fly on, well, you get it. To the fly, the large pale petals looked like decaying flesh and had the smell to prove it. Now, if you've been listening closely, you may have noticed I used phrases like faced a dilemma, find a way, and they developed when describing how the carrion plant stumbled upon a solution to their pollination problem. I've done what comes natural. When I solve a problem, I do so by reasoning and thinking, and perhaps a bit of trial and error. In looking at the carrion plant's brilliant little solution, I also assign it the same abilities I possess. In all fairness to the carrion plant, there really was a little bit of trial and error involved, but reasoning? I'm sorry. It's all natural selection, and it's just as amazing as if the plant set about to do it themselves. Look at it this way. A long time ago, before the region the plant lives in became dry and arid, it wasn't. An ancient ancestor of the carrion plant enjoyed a much, we'll say, easier life. There may have been bees around, but as the climate changed, the bees started to look elsewhere. They could move on to greener pastures, but the plants couldn't. They were rooted in their spots, literally. It was either adapt or perish, and many did. But one lucky little plant germinated with a slight genetic mutation, and this mutation altered the scent they produced. This altered scent attracted a fly, and this little fly came along to check things out, flew away coated with pollen, and landed on another flower of the same species. Pollination happened, and genes were mixed. The resulting plants also had the altered gene and the new odor. This gave them a leg up on those other plants without the gene. The other plants died out and the odoriferous plants remained. Over time, more mutations occurred. Some were detrimental to the plant's survival. Perhaps they lessened the scent, but some were beneficial in that more flies were attracted to their petals. Think larger petals and stronger odors. So those genes persisted in the population. The flies chose which flowers to land on based on their little fly programming. Large, flesh-like petals and a rotting flesh scent meant food. And all because of a mutated gene a long time ago that attracted a few flies. If nothing else, you could say the flies themselves were responsible for creating the carrion plant. But of course they didn't do so on purpose. It was just in their nature to be attracted to something that they could feast upon. The plant didn't change its genes on purpose either. It simply happened. And for a lot of other plants that once lived alongside the carrion plant, that genetic change never happened. So, ignored by the flies, they died out. The amazing act of evolution by natural selection. It really never gets old, does it? And I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Evolution Talk. I'm Rick Host, and you can find show notes and source material used for this episode at evolutiontalk.com. I hope your week is going well, and until next time, please take care of yourself.
Evolution Talk is a Rick Coast production.